Hello and welcome to the Tetrate Tech Talks. Today is episode 14 of the Tech Talks. The date is Friday, July the 8th. I am your host, Eitan Suez, and I'd like to welcome you to our Tech Talks, which is a weekly live stream where we feature a conversation with a guest and discuss technology and do technical demos and much, much more. Tetrate is the enterprise service mesh company. I work for Tetrate, and much of our focus is on service meshes, that is Istio, Envoy, Kubernetes, and much, much more. So I'd like to welcome you if you're with us live. We're broadcasting to both LinkedIn and YouTube. I'd like to invite you to come on and say hello. And I'd like to also share with you, this should be in the comments on the live stream as well, the URL to our landing page, which looks something like this. And I'm going to make the font size a little bit bigger and myself a little bit smaller. And as we normally do in our Tech Talks, we delve right into to our episode, and we have an outline where we discuss a little bit what happened in the last previous couple of weeks, what we're going to do today. This episode today, episode 14, is a conversation with a colleague of mine, Liyi Huang. This is part of a series that we do called Tetrand Profiles. But let me back up just a little bit and go through some a little bit of a preface, if I may say so. So the URL to our landing page, by the way, is, you see that there on the screen, is going to include all of the links that pertain to the conversation we're going to have today. So that's going to make it easy for you guys to, you don't have to write down anything down or anything like that. The objectives of our Tech Talks is learning and sharing knowledge around technology, and but also to go deeper and get to know the people behind the technology. And this particular episode is specifically around getting to know our fellow Tetrands and exposing our company to the community, and above all, to have a lot of fun in the process. So I'm your host, Eitan Suez, and I'd like to welcome you. And if you're with us, please do say hello in the comments. So a couple of weeks ago, we had on our show, Josh Long, who is very well known with the Spring community, and he's a Spring community advocate, a Spring open source project, of course. That was a terrific episode. If you've missed it, we have obviously on our YouTube playlist the recording of all our episodes. Feel free to go there and visit some of those. And then last week, we did something that was suggested on our community Slack, which was to learn a little bit how to set up our local environment for learning Istio from the inside, for looking at the code. Wonderful. We have a hello from Hemanta. Hemanta, welcome to Tetrate Tech Talks. It's a pleasure to have you on. So those were our last couple of weeks of worth of conversations. We started these Tech Talks on April 1st, so plenty to go through and rummage if you have some spare time and want to learn about service mesh. So on to our episode, I'd like to bring on Liyi Huang, who is with us. Liyi is a colleague of mine. He works, I believe, out of Canada. Hi, Liyi, welcome. And I believe you work on the Tetrate's customer success team. But what I'd like to do before we get started in earnest is to give you an opportunity to introduce yourself and tell our audience a little bit about who you are and what your background is.
Yeah, and this is Liyi Huang. I'm the customer engineer at Tetrate, and I have joined Tetrate for around 11 months. And before joining Tetrate, my current focus for sure is in the service mesh. And before joining Tetrate, I spent almost the last decade in the networking and like the traditional data center networking, like the switches, router, firewalls, and load balancer. And when I look at the opportunity back 1 year ago, I found Istio and the Tetrate is a very exciting opportunity for me, at least based on my background. That's why I decided to join Tetrate and to know more about the Istio and how to solve problem using Istio in the, I think right now it's in Kubernetes environment. And yeah, that's my kind of background.
Wow, that's wonderful. I like that very much because it's a background that I think is very different from mine. I kind of came up from a development background and always been a little bit further away from the systems and the networks and how that's all set up. And I know that creates for a very different perspective and a complementary perspective. And that's an interesting thing. I think that in a sense, Istio is sort of a convergence of two worlds, right? There is obviously it's an evolution, and I think you have there's more about it you're going to share with us later on in this episode of how we do networking, how we set up systems. But it also that becomes the place also where the developers come and obviously deploy their applications, and there's all these cross-cutting concerns, of course, of making sure that access is set up properly and authorization and so on. Okay, so you mentioned you work for the customer success team at Tetrate, that you've been with Tetrate for 11 months. Can you tell us a little bit about your team? What is the purpose of the customer success team?
Sure, and the Tetrate customer successful team are the team dealing with the customer, and from start from like the discovery call, understand the customer's pain point, and then doing the POC to prove like the Tetris product's value, and they're trying to see if our product can solve their pain point. After we close the deal, we have the customer engineer like me helping the customer to understand this technology, helping them to adopt the technology like the Istio or our product. Enterprise service mesh product like the TSB, and from their environment all the way to the production to make sure they have a wonderful, successful service mesh journey.
Yeah, I like that very much. I like the term because it really emphasizes that that's really the goal. It's built into the title, is we want to make our clients successful with us. I don't know, maybe partnering with them or being there, having their back, so to speak, in terms of, whether they need to consult on a technical matter or whether support with a particular product that they've perhaps licensed. Let's see. I've got a bunch of questions for you. So you provide support for enterprise clients, and it's interesting. I wonder, you have a perspective perhaps on where companies might be in terms of their adoption of service mesh, and are most of the people you work with still new to the concept of service mesh, or is that something that they've already sort of built up experience with and are further along perhaps?
To be honest, I have seen kind of both, and I have seen from my personal opinion, I think the customer who should look at the service mesh should be the customer have adopted at least the Kubernetes. And then after they adopt the Kubernetes, they may look at the service mesh or the Istio to see how Istio can help them to solve their problem in the Kubernetes. But I also have seen the customer that they are really thinking ahead. When they are moving their application before moving the application to the Kubernetes, they are already start to thinking to use the Istio and the Kubernetes to solve their problem. And so for some of the clients, they can adopt the technology faster than others because they already adopted the Kubernetes. So and the Istio is something easy for them to understand, and that's kind of that's a better customer than the one who start to look at the Kubernetes and the Istio altogether because the Istio lives on the Kubernetes, right? So they need to understand all the basics for Kubernetes to adopt the Istio. So that's gonna be a little longer journey for them to adopt like the technology like the Istio.
Right. That makes sense. Yeah, it seems sometimes I think about all of these layers of systems, and there's really a lot to parse and a lot for it's for one person to understand, much less an entire organization to somehow in lockstep come come up with a strategy of how to go about and adopt and put these technologies to use. I have to admit, this was as I ramped up, I think back to my journey with Istio, and it's somewhere along the way I realized, my initial naive impression was always, oh gosh, there was so much to learn in Kubernetes. Do I really need something more on top? But as you learn Istio, you realize, oh god, I do need more on top, because how my microservices going to discover each other? How am I going to deal with all of these different things that are necessary in a microservice or distributed application? So you come to, after a little bit of reluctance, you come to really appreciate, the why this technology was built. So yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, another thing is, if you are really thinking back, if you still live in the VMs world, like when we talk about the Kubernetes, we even forget about the basic, like the container. If you are in the VM world, you try to look at the Istio, you have at least 3 steps away. And first, you probably want to containerize your application first, and at least familiar with something like Docker. Then you can start looking at right. So if you already know that, you take it for granted. But if you really put your foot in client's shoes, think about it. If their application are still in VMs, and then you will think, you can think of how many challenges they're gonna have, right? From Docker to Kubernetes, then to Istio, right? So that's pretty challenging for a lot of a company, right?
Yeah, I'm curious to ask you. I can imagine enterprises sort of seeing the road ahead, and I'm kind of curious where they are. Are many of them already running Istio in production, or are they still maybe in a pre-prod sort of stage where they're sort of figuring out how their things are going to come together?
Yeah, for my current client, at least it's my personal experience. Since I'm in Tetrate, any client contacts with us, they should have some understanding, they should have some understanding for Kubernetes or for containers. Otherwise, we won't be able to see that client or that opportunity talking with us, right? So I'm gonna guess right now, my current client that I'm working with, they are kind of pioneers, and and they start to adopt the service mesh technology usually. Based on my client, I can see they're usually in the pre-prod, and some of my clients will go to prod like sometime later this year. But from what I'm seeing, it almost takes them almost a year or so, or even longer, to really adopt this technology, because adoption for Istio is make a lot of, like from company perspective, that's a lot of effort. It's from developer, from infrastructure team, also from security team. It's a new technology to a lot of teams, and for large enterprise, that's a steep learning curve for 3 teams, especially they need some collaboration.
Right. Yeah, they have to learn of maybe a new way of sort of working together, because it opens the door to the ability to set, for example, security policy in a completely orthogonal manner to your development teams. Yeah, I can totally see that. So I'm curious, you mentioned Kubernetes, of course, as a sort of a prereq. That sort of makes perfect sense. But I wonder, the one thing that I think we did an episode back a couple of months ago on onboarding VMs onto the mesh. And it's wonderful to know that a company has probably got the word heterogeneous comes to mind, right? They got different systems running in different clouds with different technologies. It's a lot of things are different, I guess. And I assume some of their workloads are probably VM workloads, but do you see a strong desire to do VM onboarding, or are companies probably maybe first of all moving their workloads first to Kubernetes, and then that becomes a non-issue?
I can only speak for my own experience, and I know some of our potential clients looking at VM onboarding. That's why we try to have a seamless VM onboarding for them. But for my current client, I can see most of them are on purely Kubernetes, and I because I'm only working with certain application teams. I can think of they may have other application team are still on the VM, but I'm not working with
Right.
them. I'm guessing here is when they start to adopt the technology because Istio was born in the Kubernetes world. So the first team or the first application is adopting the Istio is the new application. They are born in the Kubernetes world, in the containers world. And after that, I believe other application team, they can start to convert their application from a VM to container. And then if those applications cannot be containerized, can be the application we're gonna onboard them all together. But from at least what I'm seeing, right now, all the application that I'm working with, they are born in the Kubernetes world.
Yeah.
So that's a new application. So I know there are going to be a lot of application they're going to be on the VM, but I'm not seeing that at least from my experience.
Yeah, well, that makes perfect sense, right? Is from a point of view of adoption, they're going to start there. Maybe as the number of workloads and the adoption in the enterprise grows over time, then at some point along the way, you'll see some of those VM workloads maybe show up and get incorporated into the mesh. Now, another thought that comes to my mind is, when I read about Istio, the thing that I love about it is how your application technically does not really need to know that there's a sidecar there. It doesn't have to have any special libraries to work with it. It's really transparent. And I wonder whether in practice it is transparent. Like, it's one thing to say, okay, I've got a sample application, I deploy it and look, it works. All these microservices are talking to one another. But when you take real production applications out there and you just deploy them to the mesh, does it just work, or what do you run into problems, issues with, the sidecar didn't come up, maybe I don't know, maybe the sidecar didn't come up in time, or maybe the application had some initialization issues, or anything need to be retrofit, or does it work?
Yeah, I mean, be honest, well, from my experience is you're always gonna run into issues, and it's transparent to the developer, but the developer still need to have some understanding of the Istio, and yeah, and they at least have some basic understanding. And for the sidecar, I have seen other issues, and that works like everything, like injection, everything works fine with the application that you just built for your demo. That works totally fine. As long as you start to plug in Istio to enterprise application and trying to integrate with other stuff, things start to fail. And for example, I have seen one of our clients, they are using telepresence, and that's another sidecar they need to use when they doing the development for their application. So you can think of, in your world, you only have your Istio as the sidecar with that pod, but in reality, I have seen 3, 4 container
Right.
in that pod, and that start to having issues. And that's one of them. And the other is because Istio is hijacked the traffic from the application. I do have the client, they run into issues and in Kubernetes, and because sidecar hijack the traffic, so they can also suspect that's the Istio's issue. And then things can get more complicated. We need to sit with the Kubernetes provider together to see who to blame actually.
Yeah, integration is always obviously messier. You see all kinds of the variety of things you see is always going to be more, and so you're going to run into interesting corner cases, I'm sure.
Yeah, as I yeah, if you're doing like the demo, or if you are just trying the Istio, the booking info from Istio's website, everything works fine. You can be just no brainer that just copy paste all the YAML file. Everything works as you expected. And when you start to put your application there, then you're gonna run into issue here and there. And when you start to put your application in your environment, that's another story. And there are going to be a lot of challenges. And but usually it's just halfway of that, because when you start to put your application in your environment, usually it's just your dev, your test. But from the dev test to all the way to the prod, that's another story. And that's where things can be very challenging. And that's where we are helping client to have the wonderful, trying to help the client to have a successful, wonderful service mesh journey.
Yeah, that's wonderful. So here's another thing I'm thinking about is, there's the sidecar, of course, which is in the mesh. And then there's, we employ Envoy, obviously, as the ingress gateway for incoming traffic. And when I think of that landscape of ingress gateways, it's fairly crowded. That means there's lots of different solutions there. There's Contour, and there's Ambassador, and there's Nginx ingress controller. And I would suspect that folks who do Kubernetes, who want to adopt Istio Mesh, already have maybe their own, another flavor of an ingress controller in place. Do you see situations where you have like a hybrid thing, or maybe they just replace their existing ingress controller with the Istio gateway to handle the ingress? Obviously, there's a lot of value to doing that, because then, your custom resources like, your virtual services can apply to that as well. What is that also kind of a messy integration problem? Or
And I have seen different kinds of scenario, and the most common one that I have seen is the clients are on the cloud, no matter it's AWS, Azure, they're using AWS or Azure's load balancer, and it has their own benefits. For example, AWS ALB can have the WAF integration, can have the search. They call it ACM, basically handling your search automatically for you, and that's the benefits they love, the client love, and they want to keep. And that can be the challenge. One kind of a challenge, basically, you have a different different tier of your ingress load balancer. Because of the security feature Istio is offering, a lot of clients decide that they still gonna need the ingress. They still gonna keep the Istio ingress gateway there. So doing another TLS from the AWS load balancer to the ingress gateway. The common challenge of that is you don't have the real full access or the full control of the ALB. AWS only gave you some options, but you really couldn't control what that traffic come out from that ALB, and that's where the challenge could be. One of them is AWS load balancer ALB could just remove the SNI, which gonna be an issue if you have a multiple hosts that you want to host on one ingress gateway on Istio. That's one kind of the challenge. Another kind of challenge is the client, they already using their ingress gateway for a long time. Those kind of it can be traffic, Nginx, and they want to adopt the Istio, but in the meantime, they want to do baby step. They don't want you to replace their ingress gateway, and then they probably gonna end up with a sidecar with their ingress gateway, and it's a very interesting model. And one of my coworker Peter wrote an article about that, and showing you how that works. But that's another kind of client. And the most easiest one is they just need the ingress gateway to perform the routing. And if that's the case, usually we can just replace that with the Istio ingress gateway. But that's not the usual case, that from at least from what I have seen before.
Right. Okay. That's very interesting. Thinking on the outgoing traffic, I think one of the unique features in my mind, not that I have much of an ops background myself, is the egress. That fact that you can use the same principles for traffic exiting the mesh,
Yep.
and I see a lot of benefits, a lot of value from a security standpoint, right? The whole idea of maybe a rogue element that is trying to phone home can actually be prevented from doing that, because now you're controlling traffic going out of your mesh. Do you see that as a big sort of a point so that customers value that maybe a reason why they want to adopt service meshes gives them more control on the egress side of things?
From my experience, egress is not a really selling point, but it's a good add-on to Istio. And another thing is very interesting, because controlling the outgoing or the egress traffic was my previous job. Almost it was my previous job. And in the previous from my previous experience, usually that's done by the firewall. It can be Palo Alto, Cisco, Fortinet firewall. And however, in the Kubernetes world, things can be more challenging, since usually the Kubernetes native network policy does not support the FQDN, and you cannot just block a certain URL because the network policy usually they live in layer 3 or layer 4, and the firewall. Usually the client's environment, they do have a firewall, but that firewall is more for the the VM or even the bare metals environment. The reason I'm saying that way is, in the Kubernetes world, I'm gonna talk about it a little bit in later.
Yes.
But yeah, and when the pod leaves, start to have some traffic to the egress, there are multiple places that they could lost their source IP, and that can be a huge challenge to any of those firewalls. How they gonna keep that IP? That gonna depends on what kind of CNI they are using, and even for that, from firewall perspective, it's gonna be very difficult to know the identity, and usually they can only identify the IP. However, the IP address in the Kubernetes world is not reliable.
Right.
That's where you can see, Istio is a pretty good at it, because they know the workload, they know the identity. That's where they can control the egress traffic, and also because it knows the layer 7 information, so they can have more granular control that you want to have.
Yeah. Now this is, I have to admit, almost a perfect segue to what you told me you wanted to present on. I know you have a short presentation that is maybe a summary of your observations of how things have changed over time from your perspective, designing systems and the networks and so on. And I'm gonna maybe suggest this might be a perfect time for us to sort of dive right into that. What do you think?
Sure. Another thing I think is quite interesting, I want to point it out, is egress is a very great tool for people like me that coming from the old networking background. However, I can see Istio was born for the service mesh, right? Usually they are controlling the east-west traffic, they're doing canary deployment, and for all the egress traffics, if you go to istio.io's website, you can see they give you a lot of examples. But as long as you start to have a little bit more complicated example, you will find out their documentation is not that friendly, at least for people who try to use this feature. And I have discussed with the community, they have admitted that. And I think the main reason is usually people doing the Istio or working on Istio, they are they are the developer. They only have the mindset for the developer, not the mindset really for people like me with networking background trying to solve the problem like for the egress traffic.
Yeah, no, that's very, very true. I think back to my experience in my past work experience, and it's always been like this, that a product begins its journey in development, but then there's a major realignment that happens when customers try to adopt it, and that it's important to have a feedback loop from there to the development team so that they can then improve the product and accommodate all of these real world scenarios.
Yeah.
Okay, so let me add to our screen here your sort of outline of the presentation, and I'm going to just let you take it away from here.
Sure. And today I'm going to talk a little bit about the Istio security features offering. The major reason I want to talk about this features is because I'm more from networking background, and I have seen a lot of documents for the developers and helping them to show how to do the canary deployment, how to do the retry, circuit break, everything. And I want to kind of showing some example based on my experience to see what's the benefits Istio is offering to the people who care about the networking and the security. And so today I'm gonna just talk a little bit these three topics and to show you what kind of benefits Istio bringing, and we're gonna do a before and after, so you will get to know what kind of benefit this is. So the first one we're going to talk about is the HTTP. So the background is for a lot of company, traffic encryption in transmit basically is traffic on the network should be encrypted. And for a lot of compliance, like the PCI DSS, it's mandatory. So before having Istio, what we usually can do is we do the HTTPS call. That's pretty common. And from application to application. For example, let's say we have a full and we want full to call the bar. We usually let the full to do the HTTPS call. That works fine. And however, in the enterprise environment or in the environment, they have a little bit of strict security requirements. There can be a lot of challenges. That what I have seen is first, usually in the enterprise environment, usually they have their own private CA, they have their own PKI policy, and they may have to rotate the search, rotate the search at after certain days. And if they want to follow the best practice, they want to use a short-lived search. It's more challenging for them to do that because you are actually trying to do all the search work in the container for your application. As I'm showing here, I'm doing this HTTPS call, but but within that application, full application container and bar application container, what you actually need to manage is the private CA, where you need to do some trust. If you have the private CA, if you have your private PKI in your environment, in the bar, you also need to maintain the third chain and the private key. If you need to rotate, it's gonna be very challenging for you to do that in the if you don't have Istio before. And if we have Istio, one of the biggest benefits is we can just let the application to do the HTTP call, and to let Istio to understand your HTTP and try to convert that HTTP to HTTPS. And from that perspective, Istio gonna manage all your search. And because Istio can plug into your PKI system, from application developer perspective, they don't have to worry about this anymore. And for the short-lived search and the rotation of the search are done in the Istio proxy container. So if we look at the traffic flow again, when full start to call the bar, from full's application container, they just do an HTTP call, and it's still gonna hijack the traffic and convert that to be an HTTPS call. And by the way, this is gonna be a mutual TLS call where I'm gonna talk about a little bit about it later. And then the other, like the bars, is still proxy gonna receive this HTTPS call and decrypt it and give the HTTP call to your bar application container. From that perspective, full and bar are just doing the HTTP call. It's pretty easy. You don't have to deal with the the trust and the cert anymore. And also we can follow the best practice. For example, encryption in transit. Also, only issue the short-lived certs, and also the great PKI integration. And one thing I just mentioned a little bit about this mutual TLS, that's also a good way for us to identify the client and the server. So that's something we're gonna talk in next slides. So before we talk about this mutual TLS, I want to share with you what it is before we can do the Istio. So before we are using Istio. So one thing that is pretty common in the networking world is we usually use the IP address to identify who it is. And no matter you are configuring that on the firewall or you're configuring that on the other network devices. And we usually we need to identify who that is to do some authentication or the authorization. And for example, if we have a firewall policy, usually we identify that IP, then we can say, okay, for this IP, what I can do. However, it can be a very challenging job in the Kubernetes world, or in, for example, in the Kubernetes world, or in the multi-cluster or multi-cloud environment, since it traverses too many network devices. For example, like what I draw here, if I have the fault to call bar, I try to draw out all the possible device that can change your IP. It depends on your setup. Sometimes you even don't have the control. For example, if you have the overlay CNI configured in your Kubernetes environment, the outgoing traffic gonna be the source IP address of the pod gonna be netted. And if you have an egress firewall, that IP can also be netted. And that's just for outgoing. For the ingress, it's the same. And you may have an ingress load balancer or another Kubernetes cluster where it can net your IP. So from the bar, it's very hard for bar to use the IP address anymore to identify if that's full or not. And that's kind of the challenge before using Istio. In the Istio's world, as I said before, we are doing this HTTPS call, and we are using the mutual TLS. And in this mutual TLS is nothing but exchanging the cert on the both ends, which I'm gonna talk a little bit more in the following slides. But the concept of this is we are having an extra field on the certificate to identify the service. And this field we call the SPIFFE. And you can check out this link to know more about the SPIFFE. But the concept is this TLS connection gonna be between full and bar. If you don't want to terminate this connection, they're gonna keep this certificate there. No matter what kind of network device it traverses, it will always keep that field for bar to identify who that is calling from. From there, we will be able to know who that is. Then we can perform some authorization policy where I'm gonna explain later. And yes, you may want to ask how I do this search, how do I manage this search? And you can check out this link below to know more about how Istio doing the search for you. But here I just try to explain the benefits of using this search here. And Okay, so that's where I'm gonna talk a little bit about the SPIFFE mutual TLS and the TLS. So for example, let's say for the normal TLS, when a user tries to browse any website, let's say https https www.tetrate.io, the tetrate.io gonna give you a search, and the user gonna verify if this search the user going to be able to see this search. From this search, the user going to know if I'm really accessing Tetrate.io or not. So usually the search looks like this. From here, you can see there is a we call it a SAM field, and where you can see the DNS name Tetrate.io or www.tetrate.io, which is matching what you're accessing. It's the same concept for the mutual TLS and the SPIFFE. So let's say when we have full called bar, and the only difference here is when full called bar, usually let's say full is a client, bar is a server. Usually in the normal TLS way, bar gonna give a search for full to identify bar is bar. But in the mutual TLS, full will also give a search to bar to let bar verify it's full. But how? So from the next slides, you can see this is just example that for full and bars search, and it's just a normal search. As you can see, this SAM field, it has a URI called SPIFFE. And on the left side, you can see it's a trust domain full, NS full, SA full. That means I'm coming from a trust domain full, namespace full, and the service account full. That's how bar can know who that is, where this is coming from. And on the bar side, it's similar. It's coming from trust domain bar, namespace bar, service account bar. And those terms are kind of a trust domain. Usually that represents a Kubernetes. Usually that represents Istio one service mesh. And the NS is the concept of a Kubernetes. Service account is the concept of the a concept from Kubernetes. Usually that's one service account bound to a deployment or a microservices, so they can know who they are. So that's how Istio use the mutual TLS to abstract the information from Kubernetes and exchange that information to its peer. So from this perspective, you can see that's how the service can identify each other. After we identify each other who they are, we can perform the authorization because they are following the steps. You need to know who they are, then you can limit it what they can do with it. So the next one is layer 7 level policies, and for a lot of microservices application, when you start to have more microservices application, you're actually exposing your API on the network. And before using Istio, you probably can do, if you are using the native Kubernetes network policy, you can limit that, only expose it to certain IP, certain port, or you can doing some label. However, in the backend, it's still the IP address or the port number. But what you really couldn't do is I only expose this my HTTP slash ABC. I only have this API. I don't allow anything else. That's not doable using the the Kubernetes network policy. However, so that's one of the examples. Sorry, I forgot I have this example here. So you can see this policy. You can see I'm trying to attach this policy to a certain workload, and trying to attach that to the workload that has the label role label role equal to DB, and also I trying to say, okay, for the ingress, I'm allowing certain IP address range, I'm allowing certain namespace, I'm allowing certain workload. But here you can only allow certain port, and that's very different from the Istio, where you can have the layer 7. from here, you act because you're doing the HTTP call to the Istio. Istio is the perfect place for you to manage your layer 7 policy because it's a plain text for Istio. And I know in the previous world, you probably can do some SSL decryption here and there to decrypt the traffic, even that's encrypted. But you don't have to do that at all in the Istio's world because it's the plain text to Istio, and Istio gonna terminate your TLS connection, and we can just know what's inside your HTTP layer. And because we have the SPIFFE, we can set up the policy, we can set up the authorization policy based on the SPIFFE, and it's not related to your IP address anymore. And in this example, it's just an example from the Istio.io. You can see what I'm really allowing is I'm allowing certain, this is the, actually this field is mapping to what I show you for the SPIFFE on that search. And you can see what I'm really allowing is I'm allowing certain trust domain, certain namespace, and from a certain service account. And I can allow only some only allowing some operation. Let's say I only allow HTTP GET and for this path only. And from here, from my experience, I can see this is more in line with your attention, because in the networking world, a lot of vendor are also trying to do the same. Like Cisco is trying to say we should have intention-based networking, because networking, like when you try to do the job in my previous job, I still have to map what I'm trying to do, then convert it to how to do that in the networking world. But when I look at the Istio policy, it makes total sense because this is a more aligned with your intention, because you only want to expose your API to someone. This gonna show who that is, and from the namespace, from service account, you know the identity, and from the URI and the operation, you can define what kind of operation is allowed. So I think that's a better model from layer 7 perspective or from the intention perspective. And that's everything I want to share today regarding some security feature for people who knowing security, who knowing networking security, and trying to see what kind of benefits Istio is providing.
Thank you so much, Lee. That was very informative. I think when I think of Istio, I always think in terms of these 4 main categories of benefits, and they always talk about, there's traffic management, observability, security, and extensibility. And I think this resonates with me. And not just, I think back to a previous episode where I interviewed another colleague, Bart Van Bos, who's based out of Belgium. He was telling me the same thing. He's like, of all these 4, the security is so foundational and so important. It solves real problems in organizations where they can no longer, use IP address oftentimes as a reliable way of determining who's knocking on the front door. And here you see the solutions offered by Istio. So that resonates.
Yeah. Do you know why? Because Bart is also from networking world.
That's right. Yeah. yeah. And he's there working with customers. He sees the problem on the ground, and that's definitely something that I think that as an industry we need to sort of get over that hump and have sort of as a matter of fact, the sort of zero trust architecture based capabilities that service meshes now offer in a very compelling way, if I may add. That was wonderful. I really appreciate it. I do have a couple of more maybe personal questions to sort of wrap up the interview with. One is just want to ask you, what in your opinion is the most challenging part of your job at Tetrate?
Oh, the most challenging part is it's integration, and like no technology really lives in the vacuum. And as long as you start to put things in the class environment, things start to fail. And it's not just about their application. It can be their Kubernetes, and it can be their Elasticsearch. It can be anything that you couldn't think of ahead. So that's where the challenge is. And if you just play with the book info, well, that's easy. That's too easy. And but in real life, in real life experience, things are very different.
I like that answer. That's wonderful. Now, here's the other piece of the flip side of the coin. What is the most rewarding part of your job?
Yeah, and the most rewarding part of this job is actually seeing, because I'm coming from the other side of the technology, right? It's very interesting to see how we are solving this problem from Istio layer, because from developer perspective, they are seeing Istio just like another library, because they use the library to do the what I said before, like all the traffic management or the retry and or the circuit breakers, right? So when they are seeing that, they are seeing this another library. But from my perspective, it's a new way to identify who they are, to control the networking traffic, and to have a better way to do the traffic management. Even though today I only touch on the security, I still think like when we like people like me who is from networking background gonna have a different feeling or different perspective when we talk about the traffic management. Maybe you're just talking about how do I do the canary release, but when I think about the Istio traffic management, I'm thinking about how do I do multi-cluster failover, what the DR scenario looks like, how to achieve active failover.
Yeah.
How Istio is doing great for the locality load balancing. So we are coming from a different background. So even we are looking at the same thing, they look different to us.
I like that very much. You're right. It's, I think, a much wider aperture. People tend to think of problems from the point of view of their specific problem as a developer deploying an update to my application. But like you mentioned, disaster recovery and multi-cluster is much more impactful, and also part of the same tool solves both problems. All right. Well, last question, or maybe not so much last question, but thing to comment on. I before this interview, I went and checked out your LinkedIn profile, and I noticed that you took and passed our Istio certification exam in June, not that long ago. And that's something that I talk about a lot on the Tetrate Tech Talks. So we mentioned that we have the certification exam, and I just wanted to get your opinion. Did you find it difficult? Did you have to study very much? Did you find it challenging or representative of the kinds of things that you expected to be grilled on?
Yeah, so for the example itself, it's not very difficult. The most challenging part is you need to get your hand dirty, because from the timing is pretty challenging. It's around 20 questions during that exam. And the good part of that is you don't have to memorize anything at all. You're going to have access to istio.io. You can do the copy and the paste as you want, but you need to be smart on what you are really copying on, what you really need, right? So I like this kind of exam. It's similar to the CKA, Certified Kubernetes Administrator. They give you the scenario, they give you the tools, they even give you the documentation. You don't have to memorize any command. And even for my current job, I still do the copy paste for most of my time to avoid any syntax error here and there. So that's pretty good.
Yeah, I love that answer. I think I could not stress that more. The fact that you don't want to take it prematurely, right? If you haven't had an exposure to the technology in a real world setting where you get, like you said, get your hands dirty, maybe you want to wait. Let these concepts sort of percolate and become sort of natural, and maybe then study for and pass the exam. Well, that's wonderful. I really appreciate this, Lee. I have just a few other notes. I'm going to keep you along with me while we go through it. Let me see. So for the benefit of our audience, I want to let you know that I've collected many of the links from Liyi's presentation here on our landing page. So if you want to learn more about these security concepts, you will find it. Obviously, this links back to the documentation. This page is very, very chock full of really good information. Understanding the TLS configuration in Istio is also a very good one. All of these security concerns are spelled out here. The link to the SPIFFE website, of course, how identity and certificate management is sort of arranged inside the container with Istio, and then finally the authorization policies that Liyi was talking about. I put a reference to it there as well. I thought we might have more time and talk about all of the different Tetrate offerings that we have, where we sort of meet our clients where they are, but we're obviously going to have to reserve that for a future episode. But the links are there if you're curious and you want to learn more about Tetrate's offerings. So stay tuned for maybe a future episode where we discuss that very subject. And I want to leave you with just a little bit of looking ahead and some of the things I've been sort of digging into both at the same time. So on our Tetrate blog is a wonderful entry by another colleague, Michael Acosta-Madiedo, on configuring egress in Istio and authorization policies for egress. So I think it's very apropos. We touched on this subject here in this conversation. So Michael has graciously offered to give us a demo of that very activity next week. So stay tuned for that.
Yeah. By the way, just some comment on that. Since I work with Michael on that subject, that's where you can see the real life problem, and that configuration comes from one of our clients' questions. And when we really look at Istio's configuration, we can see the egress documentation is pretty poor in terms of how to really achieve, a more real life problems.
Okay, so I suspect that blog entry will complement the documentation nicely. That's wonderful. Okay, and then a few random things in terms of what I've been sort of digging into. I wanted to put on your radar. Now, this is not necessarily something that was written yesterday, but something I came across recently. So it's kind of new to me. I found an Istio practitioner's blog. His name is Carl Stoney, where he talks about operating Istio in production. And I really enjoyed reading some of these blog entries. And so I thought to share it with you. So you will find it. The link to it also is here under random category on our landing page. And then finally, if you haven't noticed, all of the IstioCon sessions from the April conference have been published on YouTube. And so if you want to mine those sessions and learn more about Istio, that's the place to go. And then finally, I always like to close with two particular topics. One is the Tetrate Academy and our Istio certification program, which we've already mentioned. So here's the link to the Academy. And if you're contemplating getting a certification, we would like to offer a 30% off coupon that you can use for registering for that certification exam. And finally, I would like to mention that, again, would like to invite you to join the conversation on our Tetrate community Slack organization. So I hope to see you there and have interesting future conversations. So to our audience, thank you for your time. You've wasted yet another perfect hour listening to us talking about service meshes and geeking out about it. But in all seriousness, I really enjoyed it. I learned a lot, and I hope you did too. And Liyi, thank you so much for coming on the Tetrate Tech Talks.
It's my pleasure.
All right. Bye, everyone.
Bye.